Okay, picking up with part 2 of this video, we're continuing. We've just mapped the rows, step 3 in the process. I'm going to move to the step 4, which is mapping the material contribution types. And it's green, so it's already done it for us automatically, but I'm going to show us what we're talking about. If you remember, we told in the map the column section that this column called group was going to determine which assembly group these materials are going to go into. So we call them wall, columns and beams, floor, foundations, columns and beams, and walls. You'll see here I mixed this up a little bit. We have foundations over here in the original data, but I've changed to columns and beams just for the exercise. So these have all mapped automatically to these contribution types over here. If they weren't mapped automatically, you could click on the arrow and there you get your choices. Project, columns and beams, floor, foundation, roof, wall, or none. If you map it to project or none, that means it will go to project materials. Just as a little demonstration here, I'm going to go back to map the column section, step 2, and click there, and you'll see here this is the column that we had originally mapped, but I'm going to unmap it, and I'm going to pick this column over here that was from our original BOM export from the CAD program, and I'm going to map this column to the material contribution. In fact, that's the column that it chose automatically. You'll see it's very simple, very similar. We have wall and wall over here, but here we have columns and beams, and the CAD export had column beam as one word. So if we use that, so I'm going to step through the sections again. Our rows are still mapped, and we're back to material contribution type. And you'll see here, column beam, it does not recognize column beam as a columns and beams contribution type. So if that was the case, I would have to go here and choose columns and beams manually, and I'd have to do it for each one. So that is a little tedious. So that just demonstrates the advantage of preparing your Excel file in advance with the proper terminology over here. So I'm going to go back, unmap that column, and remap the column number 9 to material contribution type. Again, just step through the steps, and you see here we're mapping to wall, and columns and beams to columns and beams. Floor to floor, foundation to foundation, column to beam, and wall to wall. So everything's mapped, we're all ready to go. I'm going to click OK. And it'll take a few seconds. This will populate the assembly groups in the project and you'll see them in the tree in a second. And there we go. There we have our materials imported into each assembly group type. Wall extra materials, for instance, has 100.41 meters cubed. If I quickly go back to Excel, here is our import data. I calculated before the totals here. Here is our conversion factor from cubic feet to cubic meters. And you'll see here I've got the total of each one. The total here is 97, but remember we had some wall concrete down here of 3.00, so the total is in fact this number here, 100.41. If we look at columns and beams, you'll see here we have 6.83 of one concrete, and down here we have 6.39 of another concrete. If I go back to the Impact Estimator and look at that, there we have our 6.83 and our 6.39, and that's the way we decided to assign them, let's say. So I'm just doing that as a double check to make sure the numbers are correct. And so we've successfully imported our concrete totals into our assembly group extra basic materials assemblies. Before we go on, I'm just going to save that file, and just for fun we'll show the bill of materials. Take a second here, and there we go. And you'll see here are our 4 different types of concrete with our different totals. I'll expand that, and you'll see here we have total quantities here, but we have our columns and beams, materials of the two different concretes there, and floors and foundations and walls. I'll just go back to one of these. I should mention that while we're here in the extra base materials, you'll see here this is the number that was imported, 100.41, but the impact estimator assigns a construction waste factor to every material, and in concrete's case it's 5%. So the total amount is actually ends up as 105.43, which is this 100.4 plus 5%. And you'll see that number, 105.43, should be the number in our walls assembly, which we have here. Walls, 2,500 psi concrete, 105.43. Okay, I'm going to close these. So now I want to import our steel quantities from that same spreadsheet. So I'm going to go back to Excel. Here's our steel spreadsheet here, and you'll see here a bunch of different structure names from the CAD program. I've added these columns over here. I should hide this. This is the information that would have happened, would have come from the CAD program. And the work I did here was I added a material name, and I'm just going to call, again, it's a short list, for example, HSS for hollow structural steel, and these wide flange pieces down here, I've named them wide flange sections, and that is the actual name of the material in the impact estimator. If you know that in advance, it can be an advantage. So I've chosen it here just to show you what happens. A couple other things, we've got a zero quantity in a couple of places in our quantity column. Unit of measure, again, we had to separate between numbers and units of measure, and I've called this CF steel instead of just CF. And the reason for that is that one of the problems is that the CAD program has exported a volume of steel, but the data in the impact estimator is in tons. All the steel data is in tons. It's a mass versus a volume type of unit, so it's not easily convertible. So what we need to do is to figure out how much a cubic foot of steel weighs, and then convert that to tons or pounds or whatever. So what I'm going to do, so I've done that here. I'm using a density steel of 493 pounds per cubic foot. Each steel may have different densities, and that will affect things, but for this exercise I'm just going to use that. And that converts to 0.223 metric tons per cubic foot of steel. And the impact estimator base unit for steel is metric tons. So remember that number, 0.0223. So I'm still going to have the same quantities here in cubic feet. I'm calling this cubic foot steel, and you'll see why in a minute. These quantity 2 and unit to measure 2 is a conversion from cubic feet to pounds instead of this cubic foot steel, and you'll see why in a few minutes. And then again, I've chosen this type column. It's chosen into walls and columns and beams. So I'm going back to Impact Estimator. I want to import that sheet, so I'm going to right-click the project node at the top, hit BOM file import. We're back here to this load a file tab. I choose the file I want. You'll see it's Excel here again, but this time I want the steel tab, and I hit load. And you'll see up here I've got a row up here with some numbers in it. That's our conversion factor that I was talking about, and it thinks it's a data row, but it's not. So I need to go down here and say, okay, row number 4 is the start of the data. So I'm going to hit 4 up here, start data start row number, hit reload, and now it's going to treat those first 3 columns as a header. So I've loaded the file. I'm going to map the columns, and since we named them beforehand, I've got material name, it's mapped to material name, quantity, mapped to quantity, U of M to unit of measure, and material contribution type over here is already mapped in our type columns. So the columns are mapped, and then I want to map rows. So we have the same problem here as we did with the concrete. We need to map a name and a unit of measure, conversion factor. You'll see here in where I called the materials wide flange sections, which happens to be the native name. It's the same name over here in the database. Make that obvious. Because of that, it's mapped itself automatically. Wide flange sections to wide flange sections. Great, half the work's done there. HSS, we've got hollow structural steel, and I want to map that to the equivalent steel in the impact estimator. So I choose steel from the list, and here we have hollow structural steel, and you'll see there it maps the name as well. Now we still have to map our unit of measure conversion factor, and I've got this CF steel unit of measure that we're going to add to our library. So I'm going back to the Excel file. I'm copying that number. Go back to the impact estimator, and I'm going to paste that number in. Control V, paste that number, and that's the number we want to use. Click out of that for CF steel 2 tons. Now I've got these icons lit up again, so I'm going to save that mapping to my material mapping library, and I'm going to save that conversion factor to my unit of measure mapping library. And when I hit rescan mapping library, you'll see here everything here is CF steel, and it's all mapped again to tons over here. So we're ready to go? Almost. We're a complete 90% down here. You'll see here we have 2 red X's on these rows, and these are rows that have 0 quantities for whatever reason in the original file. Now we don't want to confuse things, and we don't want to count these rows, so you can go over here and skip any row you want for whatever reason. And we can do it manually, and you go down and click each one if you want. Or if I can click that, you'll see here a button up here called Skip 0 Quantities. And if I do that, then you'll see those 2 rows with 0 quantities have been skipped, and they won't count as part of the totals, and it won't confuse the program. So we've mapped our rows. We've saved these mappings to our libraries. We're good to go. One other thing is the material contribution types. Again, we did it with the right words here in these columns, so these are already mapped to the proper assembly types. You'll see where it's skipped here with the 0 quantities, it's blank here, and that's all good to go. So I'm going to click OK, and you'll see here we get a warning message. And what this is saying is that since we are trying to import these into walls and columns and beams, you'll see there is already an existing columns and beams extra materials assembly. That's the one we did with the concrete. And you have 2 choices here. You can either replace all the existing materials in that columns and beams extra basic materials assembly, or you can merge this data into the existing data, and that's what we want to do. So I'm going to click yes here for merge, and then we get the same thing here for walls, for the walls group. And again, I'm going to say yes again for merge, and I click yes, and that will close that dialog. And when we go up to here to walls, extra base materials, and double click on that, you'll see here we've added that hollow structural steel that we sent to the walls. And if I click on columns of beams, we've added the wide flange sections that we sent to the columns of beams on top of the extra concretes that were already there. And you'll see in floors, we didn't send any steel to the floor assembly group, so that's the same as before. So I'm going to close that, and I'm going to close these 2 as well. So we've now imported that steel data into this existing project, and again I'm going to hit save. Now, just as an exercise, I'm going to import the same steel data again, but into a different assembly group. So I'm going back here, and you'll see here in Excel we have these 2 other columns, quantity 2 and unit of measure 2, where I've converted the cubic foot data here into pounds instead of into cubic feet of something else. So we've already converted from volume to mass, and the mass is the type of data that the impact estimator is expecting. So we're going to try those 2 columns instead. So I repeat the exercise again. We go into BOM file import. I load the file. I browse. I find the file. Again, I want the steel tab. I'm going to load. I have a problem with my data header again. I go to row 4. Click OK. I'm going to map the columns. And this time I've got the material name here. I've got the quantity in these first ones that we did, so I want to unmap those, and the unit of measure, and then I'm going to remap them to those two new columns. Unit of measure there. And this time I don't want to send it to individual assembly groups. I just want to send it to the project as a whole. So I'm not going to map the material contribution. So I'm going to click this checkbox at the top, and you'll see here that column which was previously mapped is now not mapped. So now we go to map the rows, and it looks like they're already mapped, but be careful. We have our material names that are mapped: hollow structural steel and wide flange sections. That's great, that's easy enough to do. But notice here we've imported a different quantity with a different unit of measure here. We're importing pounds. But this 0.22 is the same conversion that we had before. So but pounds is a standard unit of measure that's already in the database, and it should map to that. So as a precaution, probably every time you come to map the rows and it's already mapped, I would hit rescan mapping libraries. And you'll see here it has replaced that old conversion factor that I thought was there, and we've got a conversion factor from pounds to tons, and that happens to be 0.00045. So the way it's more or less automatic, but again, be sure to hit that rescan mapping library. So we've got pounds times this number equals 0.154 metric tons of hollow structural steel, etc., etc. Again, we've got the zero rows there that are not mapped yet, and we're going to skip zero quantities, and now we're 100%. The other thing I want to do here is I'm going to click this box up here. Imported quantities include construction waste factor, and I'll show you that once we finish the import, what that means. Again, we said earlier that we weren't going to map the material contribution type, so you see here that everything is going to project. That's project level impact, extra materials. So I click OK. It'll take a few seconds, and you'll see here under our project extra materials, this assembly group and assembly has been added to our project. So I double click on that, and you'll see here we've added the hollow structural steel and the wide flange sections to project extra materials, and those totals should be the same as previously added. So I'll open up the walls extra basic materials box and slide it down here. That's walls and columns and beams. And I guess I can't keep them all in the same page, but you'll see here columns and beams, wide flange sections of 3.63 tons. Now we added 3.59, but as you recall, we said that we were not going to include construction waste factor, which in the case of steel is 1% here. So in fact, when you say you're not including construction waste factor, then your total is going to be reflected here. So this is the 6.33 we have here, and the calculation minus the construction waste factor is 3.59. When we say that the construction waste factor is not included in our previous in our imported totals, then the total gets imported here at 3.633 multiplied by 1.0, we end up at 3.67. So that's what that button does. It allows you to, in case you've done your calculations yourself for construction waste factor in your CAD program, then you can account for that here in the materials. So the same thing with wall. We have here hollow structural steel. We have 1.41 tons, and we have 1.41 tons here as our net amount, and same thing. So again, I'll show the bill of materials, and you'll see here we've added hollow structural steel. The total is, I'll expand that, is 2.48 and 7.3 because we've added it twice. Of course, you wouldn't do that with a real program, with a real project, excuse me. But here's the amount we added in Project X materials, and here are the amounts that we added into walls and columns and beams. So I've just closed everything up. I'm going to save this project, but that concludes the import bill of materials tutorial. The next tutorial will cover the import and export of material and unit of measure mapping tables.